I'm Pete Yates. I'm a philosopher. That means that I've got more questions than answers. I do like to think that the philosophical trade gives us an obligation to ask the right questions. And I don't know, maybe it's a bit of self-pride there. I think that I can kind of do that sometimes. I'm also in my other life, I'm a yoga teacher, which I have been for about 40 years, which means I've got all the answers. So, of course, that's my problem. All right, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about time, like all the other guys in this session, but particularly with a bit of an emphasis on memory. I want to think about memory. The reason why I want to think about that is, well, partly it's something that I've pondered for a long time, for decades in fact, and it's a very tricky question actually. But however you look at it, human beings are creatures of memory. We couldn't function in our full humanity without memory. And I'm using memory in a fairly broad sense here, meaning any kind of impression on our organism of the past which persists into the present and through into the future. So it makes sense on that take to talk about unconscious memory, somatic memory and so on. In fact, memory it's not really kind of one thing, it's a lot of things. It's certainly more things than I'm going to be able to touch on. Similarly, just a little note about the terminology before I carry on with the substance. I'm going to use the term psychedelic rather than entheogen or some of the other terms we've got, hallucinogen, psychotomimetic, etc. And psychedelic meaning mind manifesting. So one of the most useful things about psychedelic experience, as far as I can see, is that it reveals things about us to ourselves. Not only personal things. I mean, you're all familiar with this, I'm sure, if you've had any kind of fairly heavy psychedelic experience, that you have a kind of reckoning with your mundane self and with the particularities of your own biography. You can get into these kind of things where you ponder some aspect of your character and in a fairly existentially vivid kind of way. But not only that kind of encounter, you also I think find revealed, you have it revealed to you stuff about yourself as a human being, as human beings. So psychedelia meaning mind manifesting or self-revealing, revealing to us aspects of ourselves, not only on a kind of an individual level, but on a collective level, on a species level as well. And that strikes me as one of the most useful, pragmatically useful things about psychedelic experience. So I have a question, a philosophical question that I'm hoping that I can kind of dig into, even if all we get is some kind of deeper or more potent questions with a bit of luck and a following wind. So, yeah, a question. Well, who am I? What am I? But not only that, as I said, that's the kind of particular thing there. Yeah, that's this individuality. What am I? Who am I? But also, what are we? What are we? Who are we? What are we? What kind of creatures are we? And I certainly think at this juncture, historically, this is something that as a species we've got to get to grips with, really in a very firm, hard kind of a way. For reasons that I'll touch on at the end, because the last couple of minutes I want to kind of talk about the future, which is about time, isn't it? I've actually structured the thing around, in a fairly obvious way, around past, present and future. Even though I'm going to start with present, talk about the present, then talk about the past, and then talk about the future a little tiny bit at the end with hopefully some pointers. Okay, my way into this was actually was through a little quote from Nietzsche that I've been chewing on for a bit. I kind of quite like this. But just a little bit of background. Nietzsche gives an analysis of memory, and particularly the certain aspect of memory, the keeping of promises. Nietzsche makes a remark, well, more than makes a remark, he gives quite a kind of good analysis of promise making and promise keeping, and how social existence depends on that. Particularly exchange, these very humdrum things, exchange, trade, legal contracts and so on. They all require that individuals in a particular society keep their promises. Nietzsche notes, historically, I don't think this is doing anything actually, so I'll put it down. Nietzsche notes that left to his own devices, the human being forgets very, very easily. We are actually, the fact that we have memory is the result of cultivation of a certain social conditioning, and societies condition the citizens to be able to keep promises, therefore to be able to remember. I mean, this has another role which Nietzsche doesn't mention, which is in the preservation of traditions. As you know, the Vedic religion, for instance, was kept alive over millennia by certain class of people remembering the thing in its entirety and accurately. You know, and again, in Homeric Greece, the culture was kept alive through memory, through certain professionals able to remember the entire corpus of the poems or whatever. So, if you look on a £5 note or a £10 note, you'll see what I'm on about here. It says, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of." You can see that the promise is the unit of. Well, certainly one of the units of social organisation itself. So kind of bear that in mind, you know, that you need a good memory in order to be a good citizen, and this is trained into you. You don't. Nietzsche's take he isn't one of these people that think we have trouble letting go of memories. He thinks we have trouble keeping hold of them, and I actually think that he's right. He refers to a thing called the mnemotechnics of pain, which is the way citizens are trained through pain to remember. Because if you're traumatised through pain, you will remember that occasion. And I think this it gives us a fairly good explanation of tribal scarring and circumcision and these kind of things. Because you need to remember who you are and where you belong. You belong in such and such a tribe. Otherwise you'd forget. So he draws upon customs which use pain to cultivate memory, so that promises will be kept, so that social living will go on. He then goes on to note, and this is the bit that ties in with psychedelia, that I'll read you the quote anyway, just to be totally accurate. On this basis, on the basis of this analysis of promise keeping, one may appreciate immediately to what extent there could be no happiness, no serenity, no hope, no pride, no present without forgetfulness. I think this is why cannabis is kind of quite popular, you know, because it kind of gives you this sort of glimpse of dementia, you know. So, in other words, there's no joy without forgetfulness. I mean, you can see how this works. If you're chewing over something that's happened last week or last year or 10 years ago, and you're just chewing over it all the time, you can't actually kind of be there. When you're looking into the eyes of your beloved, you do want to be there. You don't want to be thinking about what so and so said last week in that kind of obsessive way. You want memory to sort of take a bit of a back seat for that period of time, you know. Which brings me directly to my first quote, my first kind of example, which is Aldous Huxley's encounter which he describes in The Doors of Perception with what he called Istigkeit, isness. I don't know if people remember this, but Huxley, in that book, I hope I'm not kind of teaching Granny to suck eggs here, but in that book Huxley recounts a trip he took on mescaline sometime in the 1950s, and I believe it was Humphrey Osmond, who gave him the mescaline. And Huxley he was a great writer, he gives a beautiful description of encountering a bunch of flowers. I think I might actually read a bit of it, because my paraphrase isn't going to be anywhere near as poetic. I'll just read you a few things, a few lines. Do I want to log in? No, I don't. Istigkeit. Wasn't that the word Meister Eckhart liked to use? Isness. The being of Platonic philosophy, except that Plato seems to have made the enormous and the grotesque mistake of separating being from becoming and identifying it with the mathematical abstraction of the idea. He could never, poor fellow, have seen a bunch of flowers shining with their own inner light and all but quivering under the pressure of the significance with which they were charged. Could never have perceived that what rose and iris and carnation so intensely signified was nothing more and nothing less than what they were. A transience that was yet eternal life. A perpetual perishing that was at the same time pure being. A bundle of minute, unique particulars in which, by some unspeakable and yet self-evident paradox, was to be seen the divine source of all existence. So that's a kind of a mode of psychedelic experience that shows us, I think, the nature of aesthetic experience. I mean, I think experiences like that are perfectly possible in everyday life, spontaneously. They're fairly rare. Or through years of concerted meditation, you might drop on something like that. But psychedelia gives it back to you very vividly. And what it tells us about ourselves vis-a-vis our being as creatures of memory is that, well, memory can attenuate, it can come right the way in. It can go into abeyance for a bit. I don't actually think that in the state that Huxley's describing there, he was completely without memory. I take Bergson's point that there is no perception without memory. I do actually think that some of the be here now New Age philosophy is actually kind of a bit half-baked, and they haven't really considered it properly. And I say Huxley, I think, still had some kind of functioning memory there, because occasionally his companions would ask him a question. Somebody said to him, in fact, you know, what about time, Huxley? What's going on with time? And Huxley turned around and said, well, there's plenty of it. There's plenty of it. He was able to speak. And in enabling to speak, he was able to access the fact of having learned to speak, and to access the memory, which is vocabulary, and the knowledge of how to use grammar and so on. He was also able to have conversations. He didn't want to very much, but he was able to. He was able to stand up and walk about, also accessing memory. So memory hadn't disappeared, but what it had done, it had gone into a kind of an abeyance in the soup of memory, perception, anticipation, which is the crude delineation of our embeddedness in time. Perception had blown up. You put a lot of perception in the soup, a little bit of memory, enough to function, and the future, I suppose, was turned right the way down. He wasn't. Again, if he'd started anticipating stuff, that vision would have disappeared. It was because of this attenuation of time, attenuation of memory, that he was able to have that experience. And I think it's one of the most valuable psychedelic experiences that we don't hear so much about these days. We're all kind of very interested in contacting other dimensions and talking to spirit animals and blah blah. But actually, I think get yourself, next time you have one, get yourself a vase of flowers. It may or may not grab you. But I think that in the long term, in 200 years' time, when the anthropologists and the historiographers are studying us, that they'll say that was one of the important things. So I'm recommending that just to be funny. Okay. Now there's another mode, another popular mode. I've called this. Let me just backtrack a little bit. I've called this mode of dealing with the present. I've called it the aesthetic mode. I've called it the Huxley's trousers syndrome, because he had a similar experience with his trouser leg. The flowers I understand, the trouser leg I have a slight bit of difficulty with, but nevertheless he found the infinite in his trouser leg. So I call that the Huxley trouser leg syndrome. And it ties very much in with obviously with Meister Eckhart's notion of Istigkeit. And he's a guy worth looking at. He was writing in the 12th century, and he was a spiritual director of nuns before the Pope caught up with him and had him excommunicated, and he was told to stop telling them this stuff, even way back then. You know, it's kind of revolutionary actually to see the glory in a vase of flowers. Yeah, so I've called it that. So the other thing, it's more to do with the past. I call this a kind of therapeutic mode of memory, and this is where memory, instead of being a hypo memory like I've just talked about, it's a hyper memory. Which is the kind of psychoanalytic mode that's been popular since the 50s, and the idea that we can use psychedelics therapeutically by kind of call it this going back the way we came, you know, which of course was the central idea of psychoanalysis, is that you went back into your past as vividly as you could in order to stop it from persecuting you by recognising it, by remembering it and abreacting it, some kind of notion of abreaction. And Stan Grof's work really runs with this big time, and he goes further than Freud and says, well, you can go back not only through the psychodynamic, through your own particular past, clearing the shit out from your past by this psychedelic remembering. You can also go back to the perinatal and suffer all the various stages of the birth trauma, and thereby be free of the way it's impressed you and perhaps imprisoned you in negative and persistent patterns of behaviour. I think this is still pretty popular, you know, where I read reports of people who are whizzing off to Brazil and stuff, that very often they have this kind of trip, they have this kind of going back the way you came to sort yourself out, therapeutic trip. It's also got it's got a spiritual version as well. People who know about Ramana Maharishi, who at the age of 16 lost his ego and became the self, capital S. People used to ask him, well, how am I going to sort myself out? How am I going to be enlightened? Which I suppose is a kind of, being enlightened is being hyper healthy, hyper cured, you know. It's kind of more than being cured, but it's nevertheless, it's still in the same ballpark of putting yourself right. He used to say to people, his advice to people was, well, go back the way you came. Go back the way you came. You know, go back not only through your personal history, and then through your birth trauma, back into the waters of the womb and into the oceanic state, the nirvana state, which was what Freud thought nirvana was, a memory of being in the womb, in the waters of the womb. But go back beyond that, back into the transpersonal, which is Grof's term here, which seems as though it's a way of saying poetically, I think, that you can enter the memory of the universe, which is past, even prior in the past to your conception, into the ancestral memory, and this is where you might encounter spirits and deities and mythical figures and totem animals and all the rest of it. So that's the other mode. I mean, the first mode is aesthetic, mostly. I would say aesthetic, mystical. Second mode is kind of therapeutic, perhaps yogic, we could say, to some extent. Are we doing? Yeah. I suppose just a little caveat here before I talk about the future. I want to say that those two, and in fact the third one I'm going to mention, exhaust psychedelic experience. They don't. It's infinitely variable and it delivers infinite possibilities. The only thing I think we can say about it is that it's psychedelic. It does manifest psyche. It shows us to ourselves. But of course, there's a lot to a human being. We're a universe, perhaps, and so it's going to keep producing material forever, and it's going to be always novel. I'm going to quote Terence McKenna then, his spirit is hovering over the place, isn't it? There is no closure. And similarly, I want to say that memory, this doesn't exhaust memory either. Oh yeah, on the past therapeutic mode, I drew on a book called The Acid Diaries, which was interesting. I'll just mention it really briefly. It's by a guy called Christopher Gray, who I believe has died a few years ago. And he'd been a hippie in the 60s and was well imbued with the countercultural narratives and discourses. He'd been a disciple of Osho. And then in the 21st century, probably nearly into his 50s, perhaps nearly getting on towards 60, he embarked on a self-therapy using acid, which he took every few weeks for 3 years. So it's quite a lot of trips and in steadily increasing doses at some point. And he was very concerned actually to have this kind of therapeutic trip that I've talked about, but also to get as far back as he could, perhaps into the transpersonal. But I'm just going to quote one little bit here. I mean, this is not an exact quote, but at one point he decided he was going to he was trying to sort some stuff out with his mother, who I think had passed on, but something to do with memories of his mother when he was a child. He was trying to sort that out, and to facilitate that, he hit upon the idea of just looking at photographs at the height of a very strong LSD trip, and looking at photographs, because he'd been drawing a blank for a few trips. And I mean, this is what he said. He said the photos were the mother lode. It really kind of triggered everything for him, and he understood his relationship to his mother. And also understood the beatific parts of his childhood, you know. So you could say that this is, like, if you want to read that, it's called The Acid Diaries, Christopher Gray. If you want to get a good understanding of that style of using psychedelics. Third style, I call it, this is to do with the future, I call it dimensional smuggling. And I think if you remember enough, if you remember the chaos at the beginning of the universe, and the way that chaos produces the universe, and then remember the way that chaos is actually having its dance with cosmos, with things, with the production of things, moment to moment to moment to moment, you'll realise that psychedelic experience can plug you into the mother of all things and give rise to a massively enhanced creativity. Now I think that at this juncture, as a species, that we don't really have anything sustainable about the way we go about things. I don't think we have a sustainable culture. I mean, there's some good stuff, there's good things like this wonderful conference, but you know, your mainstream popular culture is just bread and circuses and cruelty, from what I can see. The world system of exchange, money, finance, if you study it, which I've been doing against all my inclinations, since what happened in 2008, and it's extremely shaky, and recent events in Greece and so on, bringing that to the fore. And of course the environment, we can't just carry on treating the environment like that. But to get out of the situation, I think we need a lot of creative thinking on all kinds of fronts, and I think Psychedelia there is our ally on that one. So there's a few other political things I want to say that relate to what I have just said. Trying to find a bit of paper in which I was scribbling my thoughts today. Oh, here we go. Well, creativity, number one. Empathy, community, love. Well, we've heard again this afternoon that psychedelics have a massive role in that, and a massive potential for that. In as much as it shows us who we are, it should show us that we're kind of one creature, being a bit poetic, or at least we depend on each other, that we ought to love each other. We ought to. It's just the right thing to do, and it makes life a lot nicer. That's a psychedelic question, I would say. Third one, questioning. I mean, I sat in on, was it the lady who grows mushrooms? I can't remember, Kai, yeah, and she said, well, a psychedelic experience enables you to see through the bullshit. You know, I would say questioning. It brings about questioning. If it doesn't, it should. In fact, I would say a good psychedelic experience brings everything into question, and you shouldn't settle too soon on the answer. You know, everything is up for grabs. And the fourth thing, carnivalesque. Carnivalesque. People mention festivals. Somebody. In the joy of forgetting, we celebrate, we dance. We rave, we have festivals. In the joy of forgetting, it's carnivalesque. And I think if the revolution will be a carnivalesque. You can't go toe to toe with the state these days. It has too many forces of coercion. It has too much violent equipment at its disposal. And I'm not just talking about Boris's cannon, water cannon. You know, there's more to it than that. So 4 things. Political implication, the future, psychedelia, creativity, love and empathy and community, questioning and carnivalesque. And that's what I've got to say. Any questions? I've got 2 minutes.